Hello, good day, members of the Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union. My name is Trevor Johnson. I am the union's General Secretary, and I am here to share with you today some insights and highlights into the history of the Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union. In particular, I want to focus on the Bank Employees Union, which is one of the two founding unions of BIGU, that is Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union. As you know, the merged union, that is the Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union, had its formation or genesis with the merging or the coming together of two unions, namely the Bank Employees Union, of which I was the former president, and I'll share some more about the history specifically of the BEU as it was called then. And my colleague in another excerpt, Comrade Mario Alves, would have shared and would be sharing some insight into the history, particularly of the other merger partner, which is the Bank and General Workers Union. So this is really an exciting history that we have to look at. As you know, you might be aware, both unions were formed initially in 1974 in the banking sector. We are primarily finance sector unions operating in the banking sector. The Bank Employees Union, when it was formed in 1974, when it was formalized, because there is a bit of history before that goes back to in the early 70s. As you're aware, of course, most of us are aware of the 1970 Black Power Revolution and the incidents around that, where there was a time when prior to 1970, when if you walked into a bank, you could tell by the complexion of the workforce that basically it was drawn from particular stratas of society, namely whites, the what we call the high colored in those days, Chinese, etc. And if in fact there were people of African or even East Indian descent in those days, basically they were doing menial tasks or low-level jobs. And with the coming of the Black Power Revolution in 1970 and the sort of consciousness that evolved in the society at the time, certainly it created a platform or the genesis upon which a different kind of approach, a different kind of consciousization, as some people would say, took place. And we began to see the emergence, a trickle as it began with, but the emergence of a better blend in terms of the people, the mix, a racial mix, the ethnic balance of people operating within the banking sector. And it was in the context of this that the Bank Employees Union was formed in 1974. It was formed first as the Barclays Employees Union, because we operated then primarily in what was then known as Barclays Bank Trinidad and Tobago, which is connected, of course, to Barclays Bank PLC of England at the time. So very British bank, very conservative, and that in itself had implications in terms of how staff were dealt with, how things were addressed. It operated effectively under the old colonial master system. The head office was in England, and everything that basically happened in the bank had to be reported back to England, and instructions had to be sent back to the local management, who then in turn passed those instructions on to the lower level staff. So that it was, and some of this, of course, in terms of the bank, predated independence. In fact, Barclays Bank have been operating in Trinidad and Tobago since 1837. So it has been here quite a while. But in terms of unionization and worker representation, of course, that came significantly, started in the early 70s and then was crystallized or formalized in 1974. May 1974, I think it was, when the union was formed. Um, at that point in time, when one looks at what happened prior, just to give an indication, because when a union is formed, one of the things, and the whole concept in terms of the organizing of workers and getting them to join a union, normally there are issues, there are significant issues that you are mobilizing around. And some of the challenges that workers faced in Barclays Bank at that time included, for example, things like the issue of no overtime. I mean, you could be easily working a 12 to 14-hour shift with absolutely no overtime payment. As unbelievable as it may seem, if you had to, when your appraisal or your staff report was done, you were not actually allowed to see your report. What in fact happened was that your manager showed you the last page of your report that you were required to sign, and that was he blocked off everything else, and you were simply required to sign and place your signature on a report that you were not seeing, and then that report would be sent to England, where determination would be made about your pay, issues of promotion, etc. So clearly, the whole concept of due process was absent from that engagement. Other issues, for example, that people were other issues that people were concerned about in those days, for example, if you had to pay for your uniforms, if you and that is if you were female, the male workers, well, they got no uniforms at all, but the female workers got uniforms which they had to pay for. Subsequently, with the coming of the union, I think female workers got part of their uniform paid for, whilst the rest they had to contribute to, and the male workers continued to get no payment for their uniform, or no uniforms, in fact, until over a decade later, when there was a historic matter taken to the court for reverse discrimination, where the workers finally, the court ruled that male workers had to get uniforms, so that different levels of discrimination were taking place in the bank. All of this leading towards a very, the workers becoming conscious of the need for worker representation, for union representation. A couple other issues that would be of interest in terms of looking at what led to the formation of the union. Some of the core issues would have been the issue of, for example, the rights of women. If a young woman had to get married in those days, she was required by the work policy that she must inform the bank, and in fact, they had to grant permission. This was prior in the 1960s. Again, if you were to tell a young person that today, or any woman in the bank, that if they were getting married, they had to get the permission of the bank, it would sound unbelievable, because, I mean, people know about getting permission from their parents to get married, but certainly not from an employer. But this is actually documented as one of the issues that took place at the bank. So that these were just some of the issues I have chosen to highlight. There are many others which will form part of a documentation that you would get to indicate the type of challenges that workers faced as they operated in the bank. Though from the external it seemed like a nice place to work, etc., there were quite a number of very restrictive engagements or arrangements under which workers operated in the bank at that time. And so you had the coming into being, as I indicated earlier, of the Barclays Employees Union in 1974. And just to fast forward a bit, when the bank changed its name in 1981, after becoming fully localized. I think it was on April 1st, 1981. The bank then changed its name to Republic Bank Limited, and as a consequence of that, the union also then changed its name, and we became known at that point in time as Bank Employees Union, changing our name from Barclays Employees Union, because of course the bank having changed its name from Barclays Bank Limited, it was no longer practical or appropriate for the union to retain that name. And so with the changing of our name, the Bank Employees Union, what that also allowed or permitted was for us to engage a much wider scope. Instead of just representing the workers of Republic Bank, it now gave us the impetus to spread our wings, as it were, and to consider representing workers in other areas of the banking sector, other banks, other finance companies, insurance companies, etc. Whilst all this was going on, of course, we had our other union partner, as it were, in a sense, the Bank and General Workers Union, operating in the finance sector, and they were doing a significant amount of organizing within that sector as well. So we have, in a sense, parallel histories, in that the Bank and General Workers Union was also formalized in 1974, and in fact both unions grew up, in a sense, in the 70s as fairly juvenile unions operating in a very sensitive sector, and both unions grew into a level of maturity which led us to begin to consider more formal arrangements, formal partnership, and discussions began to take place, I'm advised, as early as the late 70s, towards looking at the possibility of forming some sort of collaboration, partnership, arrangement, which could eventually lead to the consolidation of having one finance sector union operating in Trinidad and Tobago, representing all the banks within the banking sector, representing other financial institutions such as the credit unions, such as other finance houses like the Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Finance, representing insurance companies like Colonial Life, like Tatil, Guardian Life, etc., representing the workers of the central bank, and indeed all our collective dream, I would suggest at that point in time, both individual and collective, because we were not yet merged, but was that there would come a time when the entire finance sector of Trinidad and Tobago would be represented, and that all workers within the finance sector would be represented by or covered by union representation. So let me get back specifically to looking at some elements of the history of the Bank Employees Union. I sort of, in a sense, want to look at it in what we divided into 3 decades. The first decade, which is the decade from when we started in 1970 on to the 1980, then 1974 rather to 1984. Then we want to look at the other 10-year period from 1984 to 1994, and then finally we will take a look at the decade 1994 to 2000, and well, not a full decade, when we finally merged with the Bank and General Workers Union. So some points of interest to note that might be important here just to mention. The first president of the union was a woman, and I know, because we represent in the finance sector where 80%, as much as 80% of the membership is in fact female, that would always be of interest. And our first president was a woman by the name of Myrna de Nobrega, and she in fact she worked in Republic Bank, Barclays Bank of course at the time, She was fairly qualified. She was an attorney at law by qualification, but she worked in the bank, and she operated as president from 1974 to 1982. So a fairly long period of about 8 years. She led the union. Myrna de Nobrega was a very strong president, a very forceful woman, and she gave very effective and firm leadership to the union. Our first general secretary was Patrick Rabathley. He also worked in the bank's computer division, and started off as general secretary part-time, and then eventually, as the union began to develop, he assumed that role on a full-time basis. So that, and he, of course, Patrick Rabathley now operates as a member of the Industrial Court judge, a position he was appointed to in 1998 after serving as General Secretary of the Union. He moved on to the Industrial Court, where he performs with distinction. So we had people of high caliber in the leadership of the union. At that time, to start us off, we had quite a very strong executive committee operating, some of them fairly senior, in senior supervisors and so on. But one of the characteristics I remember about all of these people is that they were fearless, they were strong, they were resilient. They did not allow themselves to be intimidated by the bank. Neither did they compromise the principles for which the union stood and which they understood in the fight for workers. So the bank employees union, Barclays Bank employees union at the time, was in fact very blessed to have very, very powerful, very strong executive. And operating in the banking sector, you would appreciate that really formed the backbone of the development of the union as we came up. Subsequent to Myrna de Nobrega, we had Winston Achang serving as president from 1982 to 1985. In fact, he was president of the union at the time that we went on strike in 1984, and I will come to that in a short while. Other presidents were Steve Seabrook from 1985 to 1989. We had Edmund Steele, now deceased, from 1989 to 1994. We had Christopher Eugene from 1994 to 1998. And finally, you had yours truly, myself, Trevor Johnson, serving as president just prior to the merger from 1998 to 2002, when we basically formalized the merger with the Bank and General Workers Union. So that was just to give you an idea of the list of presidents coming forward, and just to mention that when Patrick Rabathley went to the court in 1998, Comrade Wayne Corby, who was an industrial relations officer in the union at the time, he assumed the portfolio of General Secretary of the union. So this was just prior again to the merger with the two unions. So we had very strong, very stable leadership, and most of these people would have served long periods until it was time for them to transition onwards to something else. So as I said earlier, the history of the union, for ease of reference, can be looked at in three tranches or 3 decades. We started in 1974 as a very fledgling but very purposeful, very forceful union, and that was the inception of the union. A lot of emphasis on building, organizing the workers, getting a first collective agreement signed off, which I think came in 1978, thereabout. And the very interesting thing about that period that most people in Trinidad and Tobago would remember, of course, is when we started negotiations in 1984 for a collective agreement that would have spanned the period 1984 to 1987. One of the things that characterized the operations or the relationship between the bank and the union at that time was the continuous and persistent attempt by the bank uh, to destroy the union. I think I make no apologies for saying that. That was the clear, unadulterated intent of the bank at the time, who was in fact incensed at the fact that a union was able to be formed under their very noses. And the strategy of the bank at the time was not one to seek to engage a partnership, but in fact it was one which all the evidence suggests was one which was seeking to ensure that the union had effectively what one might call a stillbirth or a very short lifespan. And the strategies of the senior management of the bank at that time was focused upon ensuring that this thing did not continue, did not grow up, did not develop. The union did not become a teenager and an adult. And the bank at that time sought every possible means, fair and in some cases, some would say many foul means, to try to destroy the union. Therefore, when the negotiations started in 1984, it was clear that those negotiations were not so premised around the issue of salaries and other terms and conditions of employment. That was a benchmark negotiation which was in fact going to determine the future, the survival of the strength of courage of this organization called at that time Bank Employees Union. We had just a few years before changed our name from Barclays Employees Union, and in fact those negotiations were marked by acrimony, by a sense of disruption, a sense where the bank clearly, by all intent, there's a industrial relations manager at the time by the name of Trevor Gomez, I think it was, and clearly his intent and the intent that he was directed to do was to ensure that that there was a breakdown in negotiations, that nothing was settled. When it became clear to the union, the senior union executive at the time, in those days I was a shop steward at one of the branches, I think it was the Frederick Street branch. When it became clear that there was no intent on the bank to settle, and of course the appropriate time had passed, the union then indicated, and we met, I think, at the union's office, and at a very charged meeting, a historic decision was taken by the union. I remember it was a Thursday evening at the union's office late, where all the shop stewards from Faz, Mayaro, Point Fortin, Rio Claro, San Fernando, Chaguanas, Arima, Tobago, and of course Port of Spain, and in the West, Diego Martin. So this was a historic meeting of all the shop stewards and the executive team of the union, and it was at that meeting that a fateful decision was taken, that we had had enough, that it was clear to us that the negotiations were not going to be settled either at the bilateral level or at the Ministry of Labor where we were, and therefore that historic decision was taken that Republic Bank workers would go on strike at a time to be announced, and that time in fact turned out to be the very next Friday, when all at all the branches across Trinidad and Tobago, the majority of workers of Republic Bank, I think the bank had some 12 to 1400 workers at that time, and en masse, I would say somewhere between 70 to 80% of the workers of the bank determined that they would, and in fact went on strike on that Friday morning. It was historic in more ways than one. Whilst there was in fact industrial action and a strike taken. I think it was at the Workers' Bank in from by a water union. That was in fact fairly small in scale. This strike by Republic Bank workers was considered by many to be the first time that you will see industrial action on such a scale from a group of workers that was traditionally considered at that point in time. Remember, in those days, bank workers were, and always, and still are, we'll call it, but in those days the term was used, white collar workers. Your parents told you about, get this job in the bank, collar and tie, and that type of thing. You could not even wear all the pretty shirts that you see around the bank today. So that this action was unprecedented. It was significant. It was colossal in scale, and it took the bank totally by surprise. The fact that workers, in fact, and workers of all colors, white, black, East Indian, Chinese, all were out. What compounded the situation, of course, was that female workers of the bank at that time had one of their issue of uniforms had a red dress, and all the female workers of the bank who were on strike at that time wore their red dress. So in fact, there's a saying, we go paint the tongue red. Well, literally on that day, Port of Spain, Arima, all over Trinidad and Tobago was painted red as all these female workers went out on strike in their red dresses, literally chanting, marching around the city, and literally painting the town red. Suffice it to say that the bank has never issued another uniform with the color red since that, and one would understand why that is so, because that was one of the most effective presentations. I mean, if it were carnival time, they would probably have won an award in terms of the array, the coordination that red was able to represent in all over Trinidad and Tobago. This strike went on for 2.5 weeks, and it was amazing the level of consistency that remained. Of course, yes, some workers did in fact went back inside eventually, but there remained a consistency, and eventually after 2.5 weeks, the strike ended. The union decided to end the strike. The bank by then, of course, had increased its offerings at the negotiation table. It wasn't quite up to the level that workers had wanted, but what was much more important than what was on the table in terms of a negotiation settlement was that the union had won the respect and the indication to the bank that we were here to stay. We had arrived, and that was basically the announcement, the proclamation in the industrial relations world in Trinidad and Tobago that Bank Employees Union had arrived for business. We were serious. We were, and I use this term carefully, we were armed and dangerous. I don't mean, of course, armed in the sense of carrying weapons, lest it be misconstrued in these times. But when I say we were armed and dangerous, meaning this was a union armed with effective shop stewards, an effective executive team, effective activists at all levels of the union that were prepared to engage the employer, that were prepared to do hard and honest work, but that were prepared to say to the employer, you can no longer take advantage of this group of workers called bank workers in Trinidad and Tobago. Because when we went on strike in 1984, it wasn't just so much about us. It brought respect to the entire financial sector across Trinidad and Tobago in terms of a consciousness or an awareness by employers that bank workers, finance sector workers are no longer just that conservative, passive group of workers that you can massage and manipulate and take advantage of and extract your pound of flesh without giving any fair remuneration, without giving any fair level of respect. So you began to see things like inputs, better inputs to our pension plan, to our profit sharing plan. You began to see within the collective agreement over time joint consultative committees on job evaluation, on issues like pension, on issues like health and safety, sexual harassment. All of these and other terms and benefits which would require levels of collaboration so that and coordination and in a sense consultation with the union, performance appraisal. The bank could no longer persist with dealing with issues like performance appraisal and making up these arrangements without consultation with the union. The union insisted and determined that this would happen. So out of the strike of 1984, that, if you ask me what was won by that strike, I would say it was the announcement, the establishment of this union as a serious union on the industrial landscape of Trinidad and Tobago. Yes, we won several other benefits, but that tangible, or in a sense intangible but lasting acknowledgement which the employer was forced to make, that we are now a force to be reckoned with on the industrial landscape of Trinidad and Tobago. I want to move on to the second decade. That is the period 1984 to 1994, and that was what we call a period of consolidation. Remember, I said earlier we had established ourselves, we had arrived, and now the union had to build. It had to look at systems and issues within the union to ensure longevity, to ensure successorship in terms of our executive, building our shop steward corps, training, development, and also international affiliation. Some point during that period, just around 1984, well, just before that actually, we affiliated with what was then FIAT, Federation of International Technical, Professional and Clerical Employees. That again brought benefits to us in terms of our international affiliation and synergies with the international finance sector, workers in that sector and similar clerical sectors across the world. Today, FIAT is now, they themselves have gone through a merger in 2000, and they are now called, for the records, Union Network International, and recently even further rebranded to Uni Global Union. And this is an organization that represents over 20 million workers in 130 countries or so around the world, in some 1,000 unions. So this our first bank employees union, and now banking, insurance and general workers union, is in fact part of this international body. In fact, we sit on the World Executive Body of Uni Global Union. We sit on the regional arm of that, Uni Americas, and therefore, again, the caliber of the union executive and the union officers to be able to win seats on a World Executive body, on the regional body, and to make a contribution at the international and the global union level, again, is significance to the strength of the individual unions of the merger and also the merged union coming into this arrangement. Back to the decade of the second decade of the union we were speaking about, and the one significant element I would pull out in this, of course, parties came back to negotiating in 1987, 3 years after the strike, and this was coming into a bit of a period of austerity within the local economy, etc. But the bank, I want to emphasize, the bank was still doing fairly well as a financial institution at that time. But what happened was that the bank began to use the wider economic issues to begin to indicate that they were not able to pay a reasonable salary, a reasonable increase to the workers at that point in time. The union made a number of critical recommendations and suggestions as to how these negotiations could be settled, with us making some sacrifices, but not not having to take anything like a cutback in salary. The management at the bank of the time at the time rejected all the proposals that came from the union, including one where we were saying uh, you can not put money in the pension plan for a certain period, because we know that the pension plan at that point in time was very healthy, and the bank even ignored that particular recommendation. And it was interesting that it was clear from the beginning that the bank's intent was to strike back at the union for the strike of 1984. And I may not have called the date earlier, but when we went on strike in 1984, it was in fact of the 23rd of November, 1984. And in fact, the bank took a decision to lock out the workers of Republic Bank, and of course by extension the Bank Employees Union, on that very said date, the 23rd of November 1987. And clearly what that what that lockout did on that date was to effectively send a message of spite, an indication that tit for tat, you went on strike on the 23rd of November 1984, we will lock you out on the very said date, the anniversary of that date, um, of that date in 1987. In fact, again, we were at the Ministry of Labor, and on a fateful evening when the parties were seeking towards coming to some sort of head, and we had an expectation maybe some final proposals will be put, the bank went and they served lockout notice, left the Ministry of Labor, went straight to the union headquarters and served lockout notice. When that lockout came on the 23rd of November 2007, in fact, if you speak to many workers today, they will describe it as a lock-in, because the workers were actually at work on a normal day just before closing time of the bank, when the bank took that decision, that I would say very unprecedented and unprincipled decision to lock all the workers in. Normally with a lockout, in terms of how the laws operate in Trinidad and Tobago, is that workers go to work and they find the gates or the door locked, unless they were, and they're presented with an individual contract which they're required to sign. What workers of Republic Bank were confronted with on that fateful day was that they were at work, legitimately engaged in the conducting the business of the organization, and in the middle of that process, just before closing time, the bank locked all its doors, disconnected or terminated or cut off all of its phone lines, so that workers had absolutely no access to their family. They had no access to the union. They had no no access to any kind of person that they would have liked to make contact with in order to communicate what was happening. It is like a natural disaster taking place, and you're not having access to make any contact with the outside world. It was unprecedented in terms of the way that was done, and up to today, there are still workers who talk about that and remember that. So we say we were not locked out, we were locked in. And what happened then is that you were presented with, each worker was presented with an individual contract, and you were told if you did not sign immediately, then this was a 46-page document, by the way, and each worker was advised if you did not sign, you had to leave. Just take up your things and leave. You were locked out immediately at that point. This individual contract, let me indicate, contained several provisions, including a 15% cut in salary. It included longer working hours. It included a cutback on several of the benefits that workers would have enjoyed. So we were not even talking a salary freeze. We were talking a literal cutback in salaries once you sign this individual contract. Suffice it to say that at that point in time, coincidentally, the Industrial Relations Act, I think it is Section 61, somewhere around there, had been changed, amended in the Parliament to restrict industrial action, whether of a lockout or strike nature, to a period of 3 months. Because prior to that, industrial action could have gone on indefinitely in Trinidad and Tobago. And in fact, there are several instances of lockouts and strikes lasting as much as 2 years or more. Whilst most of them would last from a few days to a week, there have been instances of industrial action. And I think at the time it was intended that there would be some determination within a 3-month period, so that the government of the day had amended the the Industrial Relations Act to limit whether industrial action was taken by the employers or whether it was initiated by the trade union or the workers. The government of the day took a legislative amendment to Parliament, and it was passed to minimize or to put a cap on industrial action for a period of 3 months. This had never been tested before in reality. So we were the first union that was operating in that period under this amended piece of legislation, and 100 workers, because eventually most of the workers capitulated, because this action was unprecedented in terms of its scope and so on. But the union strategy was to ensure that there were sufficient workers outside at the end of the 3-month period, 90-day period, which according to the act would enable the union to file a petition to the court for the matter to be referred to the court, or the Minister of Labour at the time also under the act had the power to refer the matter to the court. So 100 workers who were referred to eventually as the hardcore. In fact, many of these workers still have their hardcore jerseys. And this group of workers from many branches across the union, they remained outside, locked out, no salary, no pay, no benefits for a period of 3 months before this matter was referred to the industrial court for adjudication. Again, what was important in this was the fact that the bank had taken on this union and had determined that it could seek to destroy this union. And even though it was 100, not the full slate of workers, but that 100 workers staying outside for a period of 3 months was more than just symbolic. It was again an indication of stubborn resistance by the union against action taken by the bank to ensure the survival and the continuance of this union. These workers remained locked out for 3 months. The matter went to court. The judgment of the court, it is called famous, or by some parties infamous judgment, TD 46 of 1988, and that judgment in fact upheld some of the positions of the bank, including the cut for part of the period, but it restored, in fact, because what the industrial court in fact said was that because, in summary, because 90% of the workforce had in fact assented to or signed the individual contract, that the court was bound to take into account and the weight of its decision that indication by the workforce, even though it acknowledged that the individual contracts may have been signed to some extent under strange circumstances or duress. The court says the workers in fact had an option. They could sign or they could not sign, and they chose, those who chose to sign. So therefore the court said it had to take into account the amount or the number of workers, and this in fact is a good principle which should be noted by other unions and other workers in terms of this landmark judgment. It's TD 46 of 1988. But nevertheless, as I said, several benefits were restored. The union maintained its dignity and integrity intact, and in fact the union went on to become even stronger as a result of this action in resisting the bank's lockout in 1987. So we move on to the final decade as we come to draw towards the end of this presentation, and this was the period 1994 to 2002. Not a full decade, but this was a period which in fact focused significantly on the movement towards having one finance sector union. That was basically the objective, to move towards one finance sector union. It was also an era of acceptance by the bank, and I quote that the union, this in fact was said by the bank's managing, one individual who became the bank's managing director. I think he was Ronald Harford, who in some sort of event with the union acknowledged that both the bank and the union are formidable institutions, and that they were in that signal that the bank had now come to the realization that we could no longer pursue or seek to destroy this institution called Bank Employees Union, because they had in fact become a very formidable institution. The bank, or he also indicated that the bank remained a formidable institution, and in fact, in a sense, what he was alluding to was that we were like two heavyweights, so we could go toe to toe in a battle and see who would come out victorious. But that was the signal that the bank had reached the realization that the union was here to stay, and that basically, in fact, it would be more sensible to engage the union in dialogue where it could, rather than seek to destroy the union. Okay, so that this was a significant period. We moved significantly with the departure of like Patrick Rebartley to the court, and my assumption as president of the union, we moved to finalize and consolidate upon the work done by previous executives of both the Bank Employees Union and the Bank and General Workers Union in terms of formalizing the merger. Vincent Cabrera, of course, our current president of BIGU, was the president of Bank and General Workers Union at the time, and I remember having very constructive, very significant discussions and dialogue with him, because as presidents of both partner unions, we met on a number of occasions at the union's office in diverse places in order to cement and finalize the merger, and to take series of recommendations back to our respective executive bodies in order to finalize this merger. In fact, I would say that we grew significantly, not just to respect each other, but to also acknowledge the competence, the hard work, the inputs of each other and of the executives of each individual union. In 2002, the merger was finally crystallized by a series of measures, which I won't use this presentation to go into, because one of the things we discovered when we sought to crystallize this merger was that both the Industrial Relations Act and all the various other pieces of legislation did not in fact make any clear road or roadmap by which unions could use in order to engage a merger process. So we had to review a whole number of pieces of legislation. We had to get formal legal advice, which we sought from senior counsel Alan Alexander and Douglas Mendez at the time, now senior counsel himself. We had to seek the engagement of the membership of both unions in order to get their blessings. We had to go to the Registrar of Trade Unions. We had to go to the Industrial Court to deal with the issue of successorship. We had to go to the respective employers, Republic Bank, and all the employers on the side of the Bank and General Workers Union to get their concurrence, because any one of them by law could have objected to the merger. And whilst it may not necessarily have totally stopped it, we did not want to engage in a process where we had either one or several employers lodging formal objections to the merger process. And so it required very skillful and adept engagement of the employers to ensure that the merger process went through without significant obstacle. And it is to the credit of the then executives of both unions that agreement was finally reached. Some hard decisions had to be taken. Some positions had to be realigned. Not every executive member who existed at the time could a place could be found for on the new joint executive, but certainly with the best of intentions, everyone understood this was for the greater good, for the greatest numbers of our members, and eventually the merger process was consummated in 2002 and finally ratified by a special conference in 2003. So we are now the Banking, Insurance and General Workers Union, representing workers across the bandwidth of the financial sector of Trinidad and Tobago. We also represent workers in the media, like Guardian, Express and Newsday. We represent workers in some of the commercial sectors like True Value. We represent workers in special professional sectors like Cardi and Kuriri. We also represent workers within, even recently downstream in the energy sector and others, so that this union is moving ahead. We have filed to represent workers in Royal Bank, RBC, RBTT, Trinidad and Tobago, and workers in several of the other banks.